What's up, LFC? This week we're going to start our journey through the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is sort of Moses' final hoorah. We learned last week that he knows that he's not going to be able to go with the Israelites to the land that God promised them. And so this book is kind of like a summary of Moses' last speeches to the people of Israel. These are his farewell addresses. And this week I'm going to go over the first part of the book, and next week Cade's going to take us through the second half. So let's dive in. So, what did Moses think that the people of Israel most needed to hear at this point in their history? Remember that these people have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and so the majority of the people listening have spent their whole lives as nomads, living in tents. They've never known what it's like to permanently live in one place. They've always been traveling from place to place, following where God leads them. And now they're about to enter into this land that they've heard about for so long, and they're about to enter that land for good. And so Moses knows his audience, and he makes very intentional points in his final speeches, and we're going to look at some of those today. So just like how many of us have always lived in America and in a particular region of our country, it would be strange if somebody said, okay, we're about to pick you up and you're about to go live in China. And if someone told me that, there'd be some things that I'd want to know, mainly like, how do I deal with the locals? Where do I get food? What are some areas that I need to avoid? What customs do I need to be aware of? But apparently, what Moses thinks that these people need most isn't information, but they need formation. And that formation comes through listening to their history and listening to Moses go through all of the laws that God gave them, and listen to Moses apply those laws to different scenarios that they may encounter. But that's not where I would be. I would be wanting to know information about where we're going, but Moses thinks that they need formation by thinking about where they've been and what they've learned. So I appreciate history, and I love a good documentary, but not when it's something that I already know. I don't enjoy rereading history that I've known for a long time, but that's exactly what Moses does here. It made me think of when I was in college. I spent 2 summers interning at a paper mill, and in a big industrial environment like that, every year you have to go through pretty extensive OSHA training, which is good because it saves your lives in many instances. But that first year, like, you're just really soaking it in because you know how important this information is. It's not super exciting, but it's important. But when that next year came around and I had to go through all of that training again, it was so boring. There was no redeeming quality about that because it was just stuff that I already knew, and it wasn't any less important, but it just felt less relevant because I already knew all of this. And so old knowledge, or being reminded of things that we already know, can be harmless and boring, but it can also be scary and dangerous. Just think how almost every breakup song or drinking song mentions something about forgetting someone, or they hate that they keep remembering, and they're constantly reminded of things that they've done or people that they've been hurt by. So bringing old knowledge back to the forefront of your mind can be harmless and boring, but it can also be pretty dangerous and hurtful. And these stories that Moses is retelling to the people, they're not pretty stories. These are stories of Israel at some of their lowest moments. Some of these people's friends and family have died in the stories because of the decisions that they made. So it seems like old knowledge is pretty useless because it's only boring or it's damaging. So why, as Moses' last speech to the Israelites, does he spend so much time rehashing their history and going over their laws? I mean, he goes from the time they left Egypt all the way to now, and all of the failures and successes that they've had in between. So why bring this up? Well, I think it's because history is told from a certain perspective with particular emphasis to communicate a message. So when you read something like this, a good question to ask is, what's being emphasized in this narrative? How is he telling the story? Because how he tells the story impacts the message that he's trying to communicate. Let's look at an example, and I think we can get a little more clarity here. So in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 17, Moses says this: "Be sure to keep the commands of the Lord your God and the stipulations and decrees he has given you. Do what is right and good in the Lord's sight, so that it may go well with you, and you may go in and take over the good land the Lord promised you on oath to your ancestors, thrusting out all your enemies before you, as the Lord said. In the future, when your son asks you, 'What is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you?' tell him, 'We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord sent signs and wonders, great and terrible, on Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land he promised on oath to our ancestors. The Lord commanded us to obey all the decrees and the fear of the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all the law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness." So, why in our Bibles do we have so many of the same stories twice? And why did Moses feel the need to not only tell the people this, but also record it in this book? Is this passage just something that says, okay, here's some good advice to make sure that your kids behave and they do what God commands them? What is he doing here? So I'll start with an analogy to kind of explain what I mean, because when I listen to a sermon or a lesson like this, so often I consider it a failure if the speaker doesn't teach me something that I don't already know. I'll walk away from these types of settings and think, all he did was talk about stuff that I've known for a long time. But is that true? Is it a failure if I don't learn anything? Well, some of my favorite dates with my wife have been times where we'll just print out 50 or 60 pictures that we've posted on our social media accounts, but don't have a physical copy of, and we'll just go back to the last time that we did this and print off as many pictures that we have between those two periods, and we'll spend the whole night just reminiscing and talking about the happy moments that we've had, the sad moments that we've had, the exciting moments, the new experiences, the stressful times. We'll just recount what we've been through and what we've done between those two time periods. But I've never come to the end of one of those dates and thought, man, I didn't learn anything. All we did was talk about stuff that we both already knew. I guess that was a failed date night because we didn't learn anything. No, by the end of that, we felt so much closer to one another, and both of us walk away from that night thinking, man, that was incredibly intimate to just recount our history. So what's the difference? Why is it a failure if I don't learn anything new in a sermon, but it's not a failure if I don't learn anything new on a date? I think that's because that knowledge in the date points to a relationship. It's enjoyable because it deepens my attachment to a person. I don't mind rehearsing those stories, and I actually enjoy it because they ground me in who I am and who we are together. I need those stories because they remind me of who I am, and they give depth and nuance to my relationship with my wife. They give me a sense of belonging and place in this world. And I think that's exactly what Moses is doing here with the people of Israel. Moses is using this history to help these people who have been wandering seemingly aimlessly in a wilderness remember who they are, because for decades they've kind of lost that. They've struggled with their identity because they're just wandering people that seem to be blown by the wind across the land, and they're asking, who am I and who are we as the people of Israel? And Moses knows he knows that who we are is largely dependent on our history and our relationships. And Moses is reminding the people of the most pivotal moments in their history, and he's reminding them of their most important relationship, namely their relationship with God. So let's look at that passage again from that perspective of history in order to point to a relationship. And just in verse 18, he says, "Do what is right and good in the Lord's sight, so that it may go well with you, and you may go in and take over the good land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors." So right there, Moses is saying, you are within the context of a story. You are achieving the fulfillment of a promise that I made on oath to your ancestors many, many generations ago. This gives them a temporal sense of who they are, because they are placed on a timeline in which God is fulfilling his promise through this family. And so that gives them an incredible sense of purpose and identity, because they know who they are, and they know what they're doing, and they're serving this God who is fulfilling a promise through them that he made to their ancestors. And right here in verse 20, he says, "In the future, when your son asks you, 'What is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord God has commanded you?'" God is telling them how to answer their children when their children ask him, "Man, why do we have to keep all these laws?" And really, I bet most of the Israelites were asking the same question. So he's answering their question, and he's telling them how to respond to their children when they inevitably ask the same question. And what he's saying is that we don't keep these laws just because some God said so. Like, this isn't God being the annoying parent that gives you a order to do something, and you ask why, and they say, "Well, because I said so," and then just leave it at that. But when their children ask, "Why do we obey God?" God tells them that their response should be something along the lines of, "We obey God because God is faithful. Because God saw us when we were destitute and helpless slaves in a foreign land, and he delivered us to keep his promise that he made to our ancestors. We obey him because he loves us, and he is faithful, and he has given us these commands to bless us and to display to all of the surrounding nations what it's like to live in a loving and obedient relationship with God, our Creator. We obeyed the demands of Pharaoh's, but we hated his guts. His rules and laws were to suppress us and to keep us down and enslaved, and we followed them not because we loved him. We hated the guy, but we feared what he would do if we disobeyed. But we obey God because we love him, and his laws uphold justice and mercy in our society, and we are following these laws because these laws are intended for our flourishing. So Moses didn't want them to do the right things and then completely miss the purpose of doing the right things. And the purpose of doing these right things is the relationship that it fosters between man and God. So earlier in chapter 6, in verse 4, Moses gave them this prayer that became something called the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for hear, because that's the first word of this prayer. And this prayer became something that they would recite daily. And I'll read it. In verse 4, he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." So put simply, this is a daily reminder that God is Lord, that he is the covenant faithful God, the one and only God, and your relationship to him is not one of a slave like it used to be in Egypt with Pharaoh, but your relationship with him is one of complete devotion and love. He's reminding them that even though they have rebelled and rejected God, even though they have disobeyed him and have only warranted his wrath, God is still faithful. And he is extending his arms of grace, even though their commitment to him has ebbed and flowed throughout the years. Even though they've gotten it so wrong so many times, God has been steadfast. He has kept his promise to be their God, and he has fulfilled his covenant with them. And in many ways, I think college students are in a similar situation to where Israel is at this time as a nation. Because I think that just like the Israelites, college students in America in 2020 are at the brink of making some of the biggest decisions that will have the biggest impact on the rest of their life. And I think that college students need the exact same treatment that Moses gave the Israelites. Because most of you are preparing to enter into this real world to get a big boy job. You're looking for someone to marry. You're making decisions of where you're going to live, what you're going to do for a living. And some of the biggest influences on those decisions are the answers to the question, who am I and whose am I? Who am I and whose am I? You're going to classes for 15, 16 hours every week, and you're receiving great information. But how much time are you spending on formation? Are you becoming aware of your past and of your relationships and how those things have impacted and really shaped who you are? While many of us were raised on well-intentioned slogans like, you can be anything you want when you grow up, that's just not true. Advertisers spend billions of dollars every year to try to convince you that the only person that can define who you are is you, and that there are no limits on that, and that they have the perfect product to help you get there. And yes, you do have some influence on who you are and who you become, but you are not without your limits. No matter how hard I work, what supplements I take, how much desire I have, I will never be a linebacker for the New England Patriots. Because of my biological makeup and my life experience up to this point, much of which I've had no control over, I don't have the size, speed, or athleticism to achieve that. And that's just a limit that I have to live with, that I don't have what it takes to be a linebacker in the National Football League. And being aware of that limit is a key to living a fulfilled life. If I were to live as if that limit didn't exist, then I would show up to practice day one and just get demolished and have to suffer the physical pain of being ran over by an NFL running back, but also the emotional pain of coming to the harsh realization that I've been living my whole life thinking that this was possible, and I just got steamrolled both physically and emotionally with the impact of the fact that I can't achieve this, that there is a limit on me that is outside of my control, that I have no power to change whatsoever. And because I was ignorant of that, it really hurt me. And while becoming aware of a limit, like I'm too small to play in the NFL, isn't that hard for me to come to terms with, there are some limits that really hurt when we realize that they're in place in our lives. Notice when you read this book and these speeches of Moses that when Moses recounts Israel's history, Israel is really passive or rebellious in most instances that Moses brings their minds back to. In most of the stories that he tells, Israel doesn't look good. So these aren't the over-romanticized musings of a high school athlete that thought he was the best in the nation, but he was just a really good player at a small school. I mean, this isn't like Uncle Rico in Napoleon Dynamite. This is a nation saying, we were sitting ducks. We couldn't do anything, and the Lord did everything in a miraculous way. Or it's even, man, we got it so wrong, but God still had mercy. These would have been Israel's biggest regrets. When they looked back over their life and thought about their biggest regrets, Moses is hitting on them in this recounting of their history. So these weren't distant stories or legends for them. These were things that happened in their lifetime. So what they became aware of was, wow, we're really good at screwing it up. We're really good at missing the mark. It seems like that's all that we can do. We've experienced such miraculous working of God in our lives, and yet we still can't get it right. We're really just one angry leader away from being right back where we were as slaves in a foreign land. We are completely dependent upon God. So coming to terms with and learning from your past is hard. There's just no way around it. It is painful, and it's a gruesome process to go through. And we're living in a time that frankly is terrible at giving you tools to deal with the failures of your past. Our most common response when we're confronted with painful memories of our past is to drink until we don't feel it anymore. We'll engage in pornography or partying to try to overcompensate good feelings for bad feelings. We just cancel anyone that says or does something that offends or hurts us. Rather than deal with them, we'll just absolutely remove them from our lives. We'll unfriend them, unfollow them, and pretend that they don't exist. And we'll just strive to live lives that ignore any regrets or failures that we've had. Man, many of you completely fill your schedules every single day, whether it's classes, schoolwork, studying, Netflix, video games, social media, even walking to class. You're blasting music into your ear because if you're honest with yourself, many of you know that if you're not constantly pumping something in, some stimulus into your body, you're so afraid that your mind might wander back to that ex-boyfriend. Your mind might wander back to what you did to that girl whose name you can't even remember. It might wander back to what your parents said to you that night that you haven't been able to forget. And so you're doing your best to just drown those memories out. But is that sustainable? Is that working out for you? Is that the life that you want to live? Do you want to continue on this path where your entire existence becomes suppressing things that hurt you and things that you wish you could change but have no power to change? Is there any other way? Well, I would tell you that you need to do exactly what Moses is doing for the Israelites. Don't run from your past, but acknowledge it. Be honest with yourself, because that's the only way that you're going to have an accurate answer to the question, who am I? You cannot answer that question if you completely neglect the negative events that have happened to you in your history. But I wouldn't limit your answer to the question, who am I, to your own memories. I think they play a huge part in it, but I don't think that they have an exhaustive voice in the answer to that question. I would also encourage you to bring that question to the Bible, because we've already discovered that the Bible has a lot to say about who you are. From the very first few chapters of the book, we have a huge statement that we are creation and God is creator. That has huge implications for who you are and how you live. One huge step forward in my process of answering that question, and a very formative experience for me, was a time that a friend encouraged me to read the book of Romans in the New Testament and read the first 8 chapters. asking the question, who does this say that I am? And so I just sat down with my Bible and 2 pieces of printer paper and just read, and anytime I saw something that described who I was, or any indication that Paul, the author of that book, gave to the state and the condition of humans, I just wrote down. And then I summarized all of those bits and pieces into like 1 or 2 paragraphs that said, that gave a comprehensive view of, according to these chapters, this is who I am. And I would highly encourage you to do that this week. I think Romans 1-8 is a great place to do that. But I gave you a free tip last time I was here about marrying somebody that likes to vacation similarly to you. And the free tip this week is that use a paper Bible as often as you can, and use your phone only when necessary. And I'm not saying that as some curmudgeon that has some axe to grind against technology, but your brain approaches your phone fundamentally differently than it approaches a book. So the majority of the time you spend on your phone is scrolling through some of your news feeds, and your brain has learned to scan and dump. Unless there's something that is really important, the way that you approach your phone is, okay, I'm receiving information that may or may not have any impact on me whatsoever. So I need to have a constant filter of, does this apply to me? Yes or no? Swipe. But when you pick up a book, it's a different mindset that you approach the book with. So whenever possible, use something that presents the word of God to you in a manner that your brain can take most seriously, and in a manner that will give it the best chance of retention. So, free tip over. I read Romans 1-8, asking, who does this say that I am? Just transformed my life. And it taught me that having a good question when reading your Bible, it just opens up so many worlds that you didn't even know were there. It's kind of like Ben Franklin's glasses in the Disney classic National Treasure. It gives you a new lens through which you see things that you never would have seen otherwise. So having good questions unlocks new answers. And that's kind of our approach to the Old Testament this year. There's just so much that we've had to kind of brush over and kind of leave out, because we're trying to be laser focused of asking the question of every text that we approach of, how is God revealing himself in this text? And it's been incredibly fruitful. So I would advise you the same way that Moses advised the Israelites. Remember who you are and remember whose you are. Moses didn't just drag up these regrets and say, man, look at what terrible people you are. You only fail and fail and fail. He did do that, but that's not all he did. He said, look at how terrible you are, and look at how faithful and merciful God has been. Don't you see how this is the only way to fully deal with that pain? So our current disposition towards pain is to just suppress it, or to pretend that it's not there. Or we can go to the other extreme and let it completely rule our lives and crush us and lead us to do and think things that are irrecoverable from. We just think about ending it all because we can't bear the weight of all of this guilt and shame that we feel. But don't you see that the only way to fully deal with it is to fully embrace the full weight of that regret and that pain, but also fully embrace the love and the grace that God, our Creator, has shown to us in that. We have really 2 choices. We can either suppress it and pretend like they don't exist and just live as if those things never happened, or we can be completely crushed by the exhausting weight of carrying that burden our whole lives. But here, Moses presents a middle way. He says, yes, you have failed time and time again, and your regrets are valid because you did. You screwed up royally. You've messed up bad. You have dishonored the God that created everything. But look back not only at your regrets, but at the mercy and the grace that God has shown you. Don't you see that I don't have to pull any punches when I tell your history? I can acknowledge all of your failure, because through it all, God has been graceful. God has been faithful to you. He has shown you so much love. So when Sarah or I mess up and we speak unlovingly to each other, or we act sinfully towards one another, we don't just pretend that never happened. We acknowledge it, and then we work through it. We say, that was a hideous evil that you displayed, that was wrong. There's no way around that. You or I messed up, and we acted evilly towards the other. But I still love you. Even though you did that, and I'm not minimizing the impact of that or the evil of it, I still love you. And that's how love grows, and that's how real change is brought about. Not by minimizing it and ignoring it, but not by being crushed by it. God has given us the ability to enter into that sinful, messy relationship and say, man, I have been forgiven of so much. How can I not extend the same forgiveness to you? I forgive you and I love you. And from that, our love deepens. And so those memories that I was talking about and those photographs, they bring up stories of failure and times that we were very angry at one another. But we also can remember the times that the other forgave us. And man, that is where love grows. Yes, women can be attractive, and you can be attracted to someone of the other sex, but man, the depth of love that comes from the feeling of forgiveness, both receiving and extending it, is just unparalleled. So Moses wants these people to remember that despite their wickedness and their rebellion, that God is merciful and that God is faithful. And that's why he retells their story. That's why we have this book in the Bible that spends so much time telling us stories that we already know, because Moses wants to make sure that these people know who the main character in all these stories is. It's God. Man, we have screwed up over and over again, but God has extended mercy more and more. And that's my message to you, because that's the message of the gospel. Tim Keller summarizes the gospel by saying, you are more sinful than you ever dared imagine, but you are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than you ever dared hope. Man, have you ever wondered why the only event that Jesus created a ceremony for, like a memorial service for, was the absolute worst point of Christianity, it seemed? Like at the deepest and darkest and saddest moment, Jesus instituted something called the Lord's Supper or Communion or Eucharist, depending on what faith tradition you're a part of. But it's this ceremony that he instituted that points to the darkest point in the Christian experience, which is the death of Jesus Christ. The death of the Son of God is what Jesus wanted Christians to remember on a regular basis. Why would you do that? Why not memorialize your resurrection or your ascensions, like one of the triumphant moments in his life? Why this terrible, evil picture? I think it's because it's in that dark and sad event that we get the clearest answer to the two questions, who am I and whose am I? Because we see in that moment that we are sinners that deserve the full, unbridled wrath of God. But we are those who belong to the God who is willing to step in and take that wrath in our place. And he has extended mercy to us, and he says, I am willing to bear this on your behalf. You have sinned. That is who you are. You are a sinner. But whose you are changes who you are, because whose you are is God's. You are loved by a God who is willing to bear the punishment for your rebellion. And knowing and remembering that affects every aspect of our lives.